Hello there! Do you ever find yourself getting very slightly annoyed when people use what you consider to be the wrong terminology for something? No? Just me? Well, let me explain what I mean, and then maybe you'll agree with me. Have you ever seen a video game revealed and a developer states that this certain game is a remaster, and then it's released and it's quite clearly not a remaster but a remake? I see this happening quite frequently, and I think that it's about time someone laid out exactly what the definitions are between a remake and a remaster. And while we're at it, we might as well also cover reboots and ports too. So let this be the ultimate guide as to what the defining things are for all of these different terms. As a random guy that talks about video games on the internet, I feel that I'm uniquely qualified to be the person that lays this all out, and if you disagree with me, then please don't, because it upsets me when you disagree with me. First, let's cover what a game remake is. A remake is a ground-up recreation of an original game that either rebuilds every asset from scratch, or that uses a very minimal amount of content from the original game. This sounds pretty easy to grasp, but there's actually two main types of remake, and it's within one of these types where I think the confusion lies between remakes and remasters. The first type of remake is the obvious one. I'll call this one the reimagining. This is where a remake will not only make an older game look better, but also drastically change elements of it to the point where it resembles a new game entirely. A good example of this is the remake of Resident Evil 2 that was released in 2019, which changes not only the layout of a lot of the areas from the original game, but it also gives us a more modern, over-the-shoulder camera perspective, which completely changes the feel of the game, going from the classic survival horror style of the original game to having more of a focus on action. Another recent example of this reimagining style is the Final Fantasy VII remake, which again changes the camera positioning from the original game, adds in new story elements, and has a real-time combat system, completely different from the turn-based combat of the original game. Now, the second branch of the video game remake is the remake that aims to keep the essence of the original game intact, all while updating the graphics, sound design, controls, and adding in quality of life improvements, as well as online functionality in some cases. The overall objective of this type of remake always seems to be to outright replace the original game, becoming the superior way to experience it for a modern audience. This is in contrast to the reimagining, which actually ends up standing side by side with the original game because they both offer something different to each other while sharing the same DNA. So because of this difference, we'll call this second type of remake the replacement remake. Replacement remakes are very easy to come by, and this is because the vast majority of video game remakes fall into this category. This is most likely because they're much easier to develop because they use the same level designs as the original games. It's almost like doing a paint by numbers rather than doing an original painting of your own. Obviously that's an oversimplification, but you get the analogy. There's a lot less room for error when you're painting by numbers. Games that fall into this category are the recently released Demon's Souls remake, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1 and 2, the Crash Bandicoot N. Sane Trilogy, Spyro Reignited Trilogy, and the Destroy All Humans remake. All of these examples bring the game's visual fidelity to a much higher level and also add in quality of life improvements. But at the same time they retain the exact same actual level designs and general feel as the original games did. Are you all still following me so far? Good. At the moment we've covered the video game remake and its two main types with the reimagining and replacement, but now let's complicate things by talking about video game remasters and the two main types of those. First though, let's quickly define the difference between a remake and a remaster. The difference between these two things is quite simple really. Basically, a remake is a ground-up recreation of an original game, whereas a remaster is quite literally the same game as the original but upscaled to HD or 4K, and they'll normally have a few added features like trophy and achievement support, and they normally also include all previously released DLC or bonus content as well. Like the replacement remake, these remasters basically exist to replace the original games, which they do by looking better and being on more modern platforms, which makes them more accessible. So where do the two types of remaster come into all of this then? Well, first of all, we have the simple remaster. This is where a game is upscaled to HD and receives widescreen support while keeping the original gameplay experience exactly the same as it always was. The thing is that with this upscaling process, most of the time something is messed up. So for example, the Silent Hill HD collection is a simple remaster of Silent Hill 2 and 3. But in the process of making the game run on newer hardware, they messed up elements of the sound design, and certain visual effects straight up didn't work. Then we have the Ratchet & Clank HD collection, which for the most part is actually really solid, but there are some abnormalities, like for example in Ratchet & Clank 1, when you visit the weapon shop, the shop owner's display isn't quite right due to the change in aspect ratio. There's also sometimes issues with missing content in these remasters. So an example of this is with the Metal Gear Solid HD collection, where Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater is missing the Snake vs Monkey minigame, which was featured in the original PS2 release. This was most likely due to licensing issues, because this mode was a collaboration with the Ape Escape series, which is exclusive to PlayStation consoles, whereas the Metal Gear Solid HD collection was multi-platform, which I would imagine would have caused some legal problems. From my experience, it's actually quite rare that a simple remaster is better than the original experience, but they do the job if you have no alternative. More recent remasters tend to be quite good though, like The Last of Us Remastered, which is pretty much superior to the original PS3 release in every way. Plus, the PS5 remaster of Marvel's Spider-Man is good as well, although they did change the character model for Peter Parker, which I personally don't like as much, so I guess you could argue that even this remaster isn't as good as the original version. The second type of remaster is what I like to call the Remaster Plus. This is where the game is mostly kept identical to the original experience, but implements some changes that would normally be seen in a replacement remake. But because the game as a whole hasn't been remade, it can't be considered a remake. This is definitely where the confusion lies between the remake and remaster terms, and I feel like even explaining it is quite difficult. So here, let me give you some examples. The Legend of Zelda Wind Waker HD is a classic example of a Remaster Plus. It has all of the traits of a simple remaster, with it using the same code and same engine and all of the same assets and bones of the original game, but Nintendo actually went back and reworked certain things to add new content and quality of life improvements. For example, a late game objective which involves finding the Triforce pieces has been reworked to be much easier to complete. A new item called the Swift Sail has been added to allow quicker movement while on the boat, and they also gave the game much better quality lighting effects to really make it pop. They also did this thing where you could find bottles floating in the sea which contained notes written by other players, but I don't think this works anymore due to the Miiverse closing. Let's just have a second of silence to mourn, shall we? God, I miss the Miiverse. Another example of a Remaster Plus is the remaster of Kingdom Hearts 1, which is included in the Kingdom Hearts 1.5 HD Remix collection. This is actually an interesting one because this is technically a remake, but at the same time, not really. Let me explain. So when remastering a game, developers need to have access to the original game's files that the original developers used to create the game in the first place. But what if that code and all of those assets used for the original game haven't been backed up and are lost to time? Well, that's what happened with Kingdom Hearts 1. The original development files were gone, so the developers of the HD remaster needed to remake everything, but remake it in such a way that it perfectly replicated the original game. While doing this though, they made a couple of changes to the game to make it feel more in line with Kingdom Hearts 2. One of these changes being full camera control mapped to the right analog stick, and another change being the inclusion of reaction commands, which allows you to pull off special attacks, and do context-sensitive actions by timing a button press when a prompt is displayed. Despite this being a slightly confusing and odd example, because the game was remade to feel almost identical to the original PS2 game with only very slight changes, I feel like this can't be categorised as a full-on remake and is instead a remaster plus because of the new additions it makes. I suppose another example of a remaster plus would be Dark Souls Remastered, although the changes made to the original game here are much more minor. It now has password matchmaking to make it easier to join friends, you can use multiple items at a time rather than having to use them one at a time, and some changes have been made to the way matchmaking works in the early game to prevent new players getting attacked by over-leveled people. There's also some new lighting effects to make it look extra fancy as well. We're starting to get deep into the rabbit hole now, but stay with me as we talk about the most complicated part of the entire video, which is ports. I feel like ports are extremely easy to confuse with a remaster because they can be almost exactly the same, but there's normally a key difference that gives away whether it's a remaster or a port. You see, a port is different to a remaster in the way that a port isn't changed in any way across its versions, unless it's something minor that's only due to the change in hardware the game is being played on. So, to make it easier to understand, think of it like this. The objective with a port isn't to make a game better, but it's simply to get a game running on a platform it wasn't initially developed for. For example, if I was to play Limbo on the Xbox 360, the system it was initially exclusively released on, and then play its ports released on PS3, PC, Xbox One, PS4, PS Vita, the Switch, and even mobile devices, it would be identical across every single version, meaning that these are all ports and not remasters or remakes. For a much more mainstream example, let's use Fortnite. Fortnite was originally developed for PC and was later ported to Xbox One, PS4, mobile devices and the Switch, and these ports are all so similar to each other that you can actually do crossplay and have players from the Xbox One playing with people on mobile and PC. Now, where the definition of a port becomes a little bit muddled is when we talk about ports of retro games. You see, with retro consoles, some games had to be completely remade and reworked in order to get them to play on all of the different systems available at the time. So this technically means that they aren't ports at all and go under the banner of what we would now define as a remake. For example, the Atari 2600 version of Pac-Man is always defined as a port of the 1980 Pac-Man arcade game, but using the modern definition of a port that I just laid out, we can quite clearly see that this isn't a port of this. This is incredibly confusing for our terminology, and I think the easiest way of getting around this is to just separate modern ports and retro ports into two sections. Any port released in the NES era or before is basically a remake, but we refer to them as ports because there simply wasn't a way of porting the exact original game to all of the different consoles. So you had to remake them from scratch and try and keep it as close to the original game as possible in the remaking process. So when you're referring to anything released around 1990 or before, it's always a port rather than a remaster or remake. It isn't until the SNES era that we can properly start using the conventional terms that I've laid out in this video. That's when we started to see things like Super Mario All-Stars, which is a replacement remake of Super Mario Bros. 1, 2, 3 and the Lost Levels. So hopefully by now you understand the differences between remakes, remasters and ports, but there's one final subject left for us to talk about, which is the reboot. Reboots are different to everything else we've talked about because a reboot isn't normally trying to replicate an older game, but transform an older series into something brand new, often featuring elements which dramatically break away from the conventions of its older games. Just to make this complicated though, there's actually two types of a reboot, a hard reboot and a soft reboot. A hard reboot completely starts a series over again. It's as if the older games don't exist in this new game's universe, and no direct connections are made between the reboot and the original games. Coming across a hard reboot in video games is actually quite difficult, and this is much more common in films than it is in games. But it does occasionally happen. The most high-profile hard reboot I can think of from recent times is the 2013 Tomb Raider game, which reintroduces us to the character of Lara Croft, and serves as a brand new origin story which ignores everything from all of the games released previously. It also changes the gameplay quite drastically, having a much grittier atmosphere and more survival elements than the few games released previous to the reboot. There was also the reboot of the Devil May Cry series with 2013's DMC Devil May Cry, which attempted to introduce us to a new version of Dante and change elements of the gameplay from the previous games too. But what's interesting about this example is that the developers of the Devil May Cry series later went back on this reboot idea and continued the story of the older games instead of continuing with the rebooted game. A bit confusing, but there we go. Oh, and of course there's also Grand Theft Auto 3, probably one of the most successful hard reboots of all time. So now let's move on to soft reboots. This is where a game series will change dramatically in terms of gameplay or style, but it maintains a connection to the older games in the series with its lore. There's actually tons of examples of this in video games, far too many to go through here, but to list a few examples, we have the excellent Doom 2016, God of War 2018, Metroid Prime, Resident Evil 7, Fallout 3, and many, many more. The key thing with all of these is how they all change something big about the experience you would expect with the other entries in the series. So for example, Resident Evil 7 features a first-person camera, much more of a focus on horror than Resident Evil 4, 5 and 6, and a much more grounded story. God of War 2018 changes the camera to an over-the-shoulder perspective, gives us a brand new setting to explore, and has a much greater focus on building your relationship with the characters featured in the game's story. It also features a semi-open world, which again is brand new for the series. So that's it. Remakes, remasters, ports and reboots explained. But now, let's go even further into the rabbit hole and talk about situations where all of these things cross over, just because I find stuff like this really interesting. So firstly, we have Resident Evil 1, a game which was released exclusively on the PS1 in 1996. It then got an expanded version in the form of the Director's Cut, which was released in 1997 for the PS1. But this expanded version isn't really important to anything we've covered in this video. An expanded version is just a separate thing. It's not inherently a remake, remaster, port, or a reboot. Another example of this is Kingdom Hearts Final Mix, which was an expanded version of Kingdom Hearts 1, which was exclusive to Japan. But back to Resident Evil. After the release of the Director's Cut, it was then ported to PC and the Sega Saturn in 1997, and would receive a DS version in 2006, which is actually really difficult to categorize. I would say it's a port because it looks so similar to the original game and probably features a lot of the same assets and original code, although I can't find anywhere that confirms or denies this. But at the same time, you could make an argument that this is a remaster plus, because it does look slightly better than the original game, although this is somewhat subjective. But the main way that you could argue that this is a remaster plus is that it has a lot of features that weren't in the original version. Stuff like a map screen which tells you if you've got all of the items in an area, skippable door cutscenes, faster loading times, and a brand new mode which reworks the game's puzzles. It's actually a really good version of the original game. But anyway, if you don't consider it to be a remaster like me, it would fall into the category of the expanded port. So just to backtrack a little bit, so far we've got the original game and ports of the original game. Nothing too crazy, right? Well, fasten your seatbelts, because then we've got the amazing 2002 remake, which was simply titled Resident Evil. We've then got the Nintendo Wii port of the remake, which was released in 2009, and then a remaster of the remake that was released on practically every console in 2015. And then this remaster of the remake got a port to the Switch in 2019. So let's just think about this for a second. The Switch version of Resident Evil 1 is a port of the remaster of the remake of the original game. I don't know if there's a single other game that goes so far down this rabbit hole. It's ridiculous. The Prince of Persia series is also a little bit insane, with the original 1989 game being designed for the Apple II computer and then being ported to, well, everything at the time. Then it was rebooted with the 2003 game Sands of Time, which is about to receive a remake due for release in 2021. Then we've also got the Prince of Persia trilogy, which is a HD remaster of Sands of Time, Warrior Within, and the Two Thrones. And just to make it even more confusing on top of all of this, the series was rebooted for a second time in 2008 with a game just titled Prince of Persia. So this is a series which has had remakes, remasters, hard reboots, and ports. And just to add another thing into the mix, the series also went through a soft reboot with Warrior Within. How many other series can you name that have done all of this? I'm pretty sure there aren't many. But anyway, let me know if you can think of any singular games or game series as crazy as Resident Evil 1 and the Prince of Persia series for its remakes, remasters, ports and reboots. For some reason I just really love talking about stuff like this, and I find it fascinating. Also let me know what your favourite remakes and remasters are in general. For me, I really like Bionic Commando Rearmed, and I also obviously like the remakes of Resident Evil 1 and 2 as well. I do hope you enjoyed this video. It's something a little bit different to what I normally do, so maybe you might have even learned something while watching it as well. If you did enjoy the video, give it a like down below and subscribe to see more stuff like this coming soon. And until next time, bye!